All right, here we go. We are live on YouTube as well. Say hi to your YouTube viewers, John. You're on mute, sorry.
I am too. Hello. Hello, YouTube.
Wonderful. Gonna people are joining in. Yeah, close to 30 people now. Yeah, so volume 2 or the edition 2, second edition is coming by December.
That's the plan. Yeah, that's in. We're doing the fine tuning at the moment. It was basically a total rewrite. Like everything changed, all the chapters.
Yep. Cool. All right, John. Let's kick start. I will make an introduction. Get started. All right, it's 3 minutes past our original time. We can get started. So, John, officially welcome to the Voices of Community, and thank you so much for making time for us in the inaugural edition of Voices of Community. And this is very special for us, everyone at LambdaTest, and we hope it's going to be special for you too. Hey everyone, I am Manoj Kumar, and I'll be the host for Voices of Community. So let's get right into it. Before getting into the session, I'm delighted to introduce you to John Smart. John is the author of best-selling BDD in Action, as well as Jenkins, the Definitive Guide, and Java Power, quite a few books under his portfolio. And he's also the creator of Serenity BDD, a test automation framework. And in fact, I should say, after Selenium, I started my open source journey along with John's guidance in terms of making sure we know how to work in open source. And I also contributed a fair bit of commits into Serenity as well. And he's also the founder of Serenity Dojo, an online school that turns manual testers into agile test automation engineers. He's a very well-known international speaker, consultant, author, trainer, multiple hats. John, I hope we'll be adding more hats under your persona. And yeah, his presentations and articles are very special in the area of BDD, TDD, test automation, and especially around software craftsmanship and team collaboration. And John helps organizations and teams around the world deliver better software sooner through effective collaboration and communication techniques. And here we are today. He's going to talk about BDD pitfalls and how to avoid them. John, over to you. Stage is yours.
Thank you. That's a great introduction. Let me share the screen and we can have it. So I wanted to really just have a chat about behavior-driven development. I see a lot of folk trying to do behavior-driven development and basically making a hash of it. So I wanted to put together some tips and tricks based on what I've seen so that people could avoid that sort of issue. And so to understand that, let me run through some slides. So to understand what actually goes wrong and what we need to avoid, I wanted to walk through a few of the biggest red flags that I see. So obviously there's a lot that can go wrong with behavior-driven development. In fact, I'd say that most teams do it wrong. Maybe 95% of teams do BDD wrong. And 95% of teams, I would say, add overhead and add extra work and introduce waste by the way they do BDD, which is a shame because it's a really, really powerful technique if you do it well. It's just as, I don't know, it's human nature to like a shiny tool and to pick up go for the easiest option of picking up the latest shiny tool and using it rather than doing a little bit more thought about how to actually apply a process or how a practice should be applied. Collaboration seems to be much harder than picking up a tool for some reason. So with that little ramble out of the way, let's get started. Really, there are three big areas that I find people stumbling on. One is around the way people write user stories. It's not a it's subtle. There's a huge red flag about when people write user stories. There's a way that people write user stories that basically tells me that they will that they are basically not being agile, not working in a collaborative manner. So we'll talk about that. We'll also look at what's wrong with Cucumber. Why do most people use Cucumber incorrectly? Why do most people who do test automation with Cucumber do it totally wrong and double, triple the time they need to spend on automation, or even worse, make automation basically useless. So we'll talk about that, and then I'll try not to be too negative. I will give some tips on what we can do to improve things. So there is a link at the bottom of this page. There is another version of this talk, plus some resources and some other useful tips and tricks on that page. So if you want to sort of get an overview, get some extra information, so you can head over there and take a look. So the first pitfall, I would say, is user story writing. It's probably the easiest one to fix in some ways. In other ways, it's the hardest one to fix because it involves changing the way people behave. So what I find is user story writing can hold people back. I mean, there's actually some contention about whether user stories are actually a good thing, but that's a separate question. But what I mean is the way people write user stories, the way they write them down. And it turns out that there are many cases where just looking at a user story, I can look at the stories in Jira and say, this team will not be able to do effective BDD or effective Agile in general, simply because of the way the user stories are written. See, the trap comes from a misunderstanding of what user stories are actually about. And what this causes, what you see in this sort of problem is teams that take too long to write user stories, spend a lot of time writing them, go into great detail writing them. Teams that, or analysts that end up, or that will do write a huge, big, detailed user story, deliver it to the team, then they deliver it, and then it's not actually what they want, needs a lot of rework and fixes. So if you come across those symptoms, often what I find the single biggest problem with user stories, the single biggest indicator of dysfunctional user stories, I'd say it's a red flag. It's a thing that tells you there's something wrong. So it's not the only reason. It's just an indicator that there is something wrong with the user story writing process. And it's very, very simple. And it's taught by thousands of people when they teach Scrum and Agile, and it's totally rubbish. It's evil, needs to be eliminated. It's the use of given, when, then in acceptance criteria in Jira or in the user story. Needs to be banned, needs to be banished. It's an abomination. It basically breaks the Agile flow, and it indicates that a team is thinking that a user story is a type of old school requirements document where you have to put as much in as possible. It also indicates that they've been told that they need to use given, when, then, but they have no idea how it works. So they just put a whole lot of text in the given, when, then format and think that they have to do that because it's Agile. It takes way longer to do than it would normally. And guess what? When you get to actually automating it or understanding it with the team just throws it away and does something else. So it is effectively a massive waste of time. And to prove this sort of point, which may be surprising, I'll give you an example. So we look at this story, an innocent enough looking story. Check the email addresses on your accounts. As a user, I want to have my email address verified when I register for a new account so that I can enter the right email address. Okay. So acceptance criteria, given I'm on a registration page, when I enter my email address and the email address is verified, and if the email address is invalid, there is an error message. This is a simple version of what I see quite a lot of dysfunctional user stories. Now, you might ask, what's dysfunctional about that? For one thing, this can't be automated, but that's fairly subtle to see. But there's a more subtle thing in what happens when you write acceptance criteria in this format. See, here you have an acceptance criteria, just one. And it gives the impression that it's finished, that it's the definitive acceptance criteria. But in a BDD process, or in an agile process, that's not how stories work. Stories are what we call a placeholder for a conversation. Stories are never designed to be used as full requirements, point to requirements. They're not supposed to have the definitive version of a set of requirements. So when you try and give definitive acceptance criteria, you're giving the impression that you've done the work, and that cuts off the conversation. That's a cognitive bias thing. You get into a type of cognitive bias called, anchoring. I think it's anchoring. I think anchoring is the one. But anyway, basically you're giving a finished solution, so there's no motivation to have any conversations. Acceptance criteria should be simple bullet points, maybe tables, examples. They should not be a definitive given when then format, not at this stage. The given when then really is the outcome of the conversation, not what goes in. Another example that I see where this gets even more hairy is when you see things like this. So I see this a lot too. Again, same sort of idea, but basically what's happening here is the BA is trying to write down everything they can think of, the whole flow, the whole user journey in the given when then format, and it becomes very random, very hard to understand. What is the business rule we're applying? How many business rules are there? What is going on here? When we have given when then scenarios like this, especially when they're written in Jira, it makes things really, really hard to understand, really, really hard to know what's going on. So don't get me wrong, given when then format is very useful for acceptance criteria, but starting with them is a really, really bad idea. They should be the output of the conversation, not the input. Because very simply put, your typical product owner or functional analyst or whoever is meant to write user stories, they're not very good at it. They're not trained to write Gherkin. They're trained to express their business requirements. So by asking them to write this given when then format, you're basically just putting an unnecessary burden on them and distracting them from writing down the actual requirements. It makes them slower. They take longer to write the requirements, and the requirements are of much poorer quality. It also cuts out the conversation. You end up basically not giving the team the chance that they need to understand, to discuss, to try and flesh out the details, to find the edge cases. And I've seen so many cases where there's a definitive given when then given as the acceptance criteria. And so the team doesn't look for edge cases. And guess what? The edge cases are there. They trip them up during development or once it gets out into production, they have to go and change everything. But had they had a conversation, they would have been able to find those edge cases, but not if the product owner or whoever wrote the user story wrote down an acceptance criteria as if it was the definitive final version of them. So this concept of where you write the acceptance criteria and when you write them is really, really important. But it does in very pragmatic, practical terms, lead to missing requirements. It leads to misunderstood requirements or incomplete requirements. So for a whole host of very subtle reasons, writing given when thens at the start of the process in the user stories in Jira or wherever you're holding them, is an indicator that your user story writing process is a bit rubbish and probably needs some thought. So I guess the question is, well, what should you do instead? Where do you write down all these requirements? Sure, how on earth can I write down and tell the team what to do and dictate to the team if I can't write down my requirements and send them an email or write down the requirements and put them in Jira? How on earth can I tell the team what to do? How will I know that they'll do what I want? How can I make sure they have everything that they'll do everything I say they'll do without me having to be bothered talking to them? Well, that's kind of the heart of the problem. When you try and write down a definitive user story, you're not using an agile process. An agile process is based on the concept that conversation is more effective than written documentation as a means to convey understanding, a means to convey more than information, understanding. Face-to-face conversation is really the way to go. It's not sufficient in itself, but it's a starting point. And it comes back to a very old concept, a card conversation confirmation, which people seem to have forgotten a little bit these days. But Ron Jeffries came up with this term in the early 2000s. The idea that a user story has three parts to it. A card which represents the requirement, that it is not the requirement, it is a pointer to the requirement. And if there are other documents, that's fine, you can put them elsewhere, but the story itself is just a card, very little information. And I think might have been Ron Jeffries, I'm not 100% sure. Could have been Ken Beck. It sounds like something Ken Beck would say. When asked, what do you do if the user story doesn't fit on the card, he said, well, make the card smaller. Because if a user story is so big it doesn't fit on the card, it's not really a user story. It needs to be broken down further. So user stories are not meant to be big. But then the card is just a placeholder for a conversation, as we say. It's the starting point. So after the card, we have the conversation, and that's where BDD introduces a lot of its power, where we use techniques like example mapping and feature mapping. If you bake that into your process and you actually rigorously do example mapping sessions or feature mapping sessions, or there are other techniques, sometimes a whiteboard and a table are sufficient, but you want a rigorous process where you are actually coming up with examples and rules and acceptance criteria from the conversation. You're not being given a set of acceptance criteria, because the whole point of acceptance criteria is not for the product owner to say what the team should do. The purpose of an acceptance criteria is for the team to prove to the product owner that they know what to do. And that's very different. So you can see there's a lot more than just format, right? User story writing format going on here. There's a whole lot of behavioral changes. So that's why I say it's both the easiest and the hardest thing to change. Now, the confirmation, that's where we can use a given when then format. You don't have to. You can use tables. You can use, I know folk who, I do it too, can write acceptance criteria in Java or JavaScript or Python and make it very readable. That's fine as well. But one way of writing readable acceptance criteria is to use something like the given when then format. As long as it's a way of communicating with the business, not a way of writing test scripts. It's really rubbish at writing test scripts. But if you're writing test scripts with a long narrative style, your test scripts will probably be rubbish anyway. So the idea of Cucumber is really to be able to automate executable specifications. It has a very specific use case, which is writing requirements in an executable format with the intention of validating them with the product owner. if you're not communicating with the product owner, you want to ask the question, is it worth using something like Cucumber? Now BDD can be done in many different ways. You don't need to use that given when then format. If you're having the conversation, coming up with examples, and you automate them with other tools, that's fine as well. The feedback cycles are the important thing, and the living documentation. The actual tool is very variable. So it is really important to remember this idea that user stories are just conversation starters. So rather than writing something like this, given I'm on a registration page and so forth, rather than writing that, we could simply write something like this. As a portfolio manager, I want to ensure that email addresses of our new customers are correct and current so that they can be notified when their portfolio is rebalanced. So something very concrete and focused, and gives them idea of the actual reason. And so you might say, well, where's the given when then? Where are the acceptance criteria? How do I know that it's supposed to be what it's supposed to do? Well, traditionally, we would just write them down on the back of a user story card, on the back of an index card as bullet points. And that works fine as well. Acceptance criteria don't need to have that given when then format at this stage. You just need to note down in free text, or tables, or tables work well as well. Note them down just to get the information, the business understanding. Don't worry about the format. And if we take something like this long example, which I won't read because it's boring, and it's hard to see what it actually is. If we turn that into a proper user story, we might say, well, as a sales manager, I want to run discount deals on different products each day so that the customer stays more engaged and visits our site more often. And so if we compare this to this, suddenly the user requirement is actually clear. We can actually see what it is we're supposed to be asking, which was not at all clear from the given when then. And once again, acceptance criteria. What do they look like? Well, bullet points are fine. Discounts should be clearly visible. Discounts should appear on the product page. Daily discounts expire at midnight, and so forth. So that is perfectly sufficient and richer. That in less text, we get a lot more information than we did in the previous versions. So if we take this a little bit further, there are other ways we can write this as well. We might say, rather than as I want to say that, we could say something like, in order to keep customers engaged and encourage them to visit the site often, we run daily discounts. And then we might just write some plain text. Plain text is cool. Plain text works well if you know if you know that you're actually representing the information you need to with the business goals, then plain text is absolutely fine. Then you can add some acceptance criteria down the bottom. And that works exceedingly well because that is the starter for your conversation. You might point to, I don't know, a Confluence page or some documentation that describes the list of product discounts or previous discounts or some other reference information that people would find useful to have this conversation. But as the actual placeholder for a conversation, then this is absolutely fine. So if we move on to the actual conversation techniques, what does that look like? Well, we can do lots of things. We can record the conversation in a tabular format. So I'm a big fan of tables. So write tables on a whiteboard or a virtual whiteboard. That works really well. We can do things like example mapping, where we try and flesh out, understand the business rules that are in play, and come up with examples and counterexamples around those business rules. And above all, we record them so that we don't just have a rambling conversation then forget about them afterwards, because that's never much fun. So example mapping is a really good technique because you get a lot of breadth, a lot of edge cases covered, a lot of uncertainty uncovered, a lot of uncertainty solved in a relatively short space of time. It does take some discipline. It's not that easy to do. You have to actually drive an example mapping session. So you need someone who knows what they're doing to run it. And then so it needs a little bit of practice. But it's a simple technique to learn. Feature mapping is similar. Feature mapping is all about trying to understand user journeys and user flows and mapping out variations of the flows. And one of the nice things about feature mapping is your given when then scenarios kind of fall out of it. It's very easy to go from a feature map to a given when then scenario. That's actually how feature maps were invented, as a way to teach how to write given when then scenarios properly. But both of those techniques, example mapping and feature mapping, are very easy to do, very easy to introduce into 3 Amigo sessions, and very, very effective. But you do need the discipline to actually do them. See, a lot of teams will struggle to do that initially. So it does need someone who sort of drives them, basically. But the value is really, really enormous. Then the third bit, confirmation. So what do we mean by confirmation? So these ideas, like I said, they go back to 2001, I think. Ron Jeffries came up with these concepts. So it's not really that new. And I remember I was using Excel spreadsheets to come up with write executable specifications in 2001. So these concepts are not that new, but they're still very, very applicable. So what do we mean by confirmation? The confirmation is, how do we prove that the acceptance test actually that the acceptance criteria were met? And that's what an automated acceptance test does. So if we have our daily discounts example, we have come up with here I've got an example map. Well, what's in the example map? We've got some discounts, should appear on the homepage. Discounts are applied on checkout. Discounts expire at midnight. And from there, we can derive some given when then scenario. So you can see here, the given when then has evolved from the acceptance criteria. So the given when then scenarios are more concrete and more granular, but they still represent the business goals. So there's not very much in terms of UI here. This is very much focused on business rules. And this is sort of fairly typical, where this is what we do in what we call the formalize phase of BDD. We formalize the acceptance criteria so that we can turn them into an executable format. And then when we take that executable format, before I continue this can generally be done and should be done before work starts, because you formalize it and you ratify it. So these are not test scripts. If you use these as test scripts, you're wasting your time, because the whole purpose of them is to get validation from the product owner that you have understood the requirements before. And if you do that after you've built the software, it's kind of no point. You wasted the whole sprint building something when you're not even sure that it's what you're supposed to build. So the whole purpose of this is to use this given when then format to ratify the acceptance criteria, to ratify your understanding. You do that before the work starts. Then you can go and automate them. Now, do you automate them before the work starts or after? If you're doing microservices, there's no excuse not to automate before any work starts or as you go. Microservices, which we do a lot of these days, are very easy to drive from the outside in. From if you have UI-based journeys, UI-based scenarios, then it becomes, you usually need to do it in roughly the same time. So someone's asking about reusable or step definition. I would say something contentious here. Reusability is overrated. So what I've seen people sometimes do is come up with a really reusable framework where you can click on this button, all that. They're rubbish, really hard to maintain. They may be reusable with a click button, but the reusability is not useful. It doesn't help for maintenance. Real reusability comes from reuse of business tasks and business concepts. So in this particular scenario, we've got, given the following discounts are active, there might be lots of different scenarios which explore different types of discounts and different ways, different things you can do with discounts, which would all use that step. That's the sort of, and for the cart should include the following items. So again, that sort of reuse, that might be something that's reused. This is the UI one, it's a little bit boring. But when you, basically what you need to do to get reuse in step definitions and reuse in your Gherkin scenarios is to reuse the business tasks, not the interactions. So if you've got clicks and selects in your interactions, in your Gherkin, if you've got click here, select this, delete them all. RM-F. Get rid of them all, because they will, and I'm not joking. I worked with a team recently where the tester had a whole lot of scripts like that, and we deleted them all and he rewrote them all with 20% of the code, not 20% less code, 20% of the code. It was like 10,000 lines. It ended up being 2,000 lines. And code that took 80 to 90% less time to write new scenarios. Just by rewriting the Gherkin properly. And that's going from moving from a test script style approach to a declarative style. It does make a huge impact when you write the Gherkin properly and at the business level. It saves a huge amount of time. Then demonstrate. Now, demonstrate is simply the ability to be able to show that what you have delivered corresponds to your business requirements. So this is where the concept of living documentation. So the screenshot here is from Serenity BDD, which would mean in this project you'd be using Serenity BDD or Serenity JS, so using Java or TypeScript. And that particular tool, one of its big selling points, so to speak, is that it came out of the idea of, can you write living documentation out of tests? So it's all about living documentation. But if you use Allure and other, even Playwright, the native reporting in Playwright's pretty good. If you write your tests in a readable way, and that evidence that you get, that reporting that you get out of your execution, that becomes part of your product documentation. So it both proves that you have delivered what you said you delivered, and also documents what your feature's supposed to be doing. So I do a lot of work in banks, and it's very important to be able to show to auditors what feature was delivered in a particular release, how it was tested, and so forth. And so that you get that with this sort of rich documentation. So yeah, it is really, really important to this concept of having your acceptance tests that demonstrate the business functionality, that demonstrate what you're actually delivering is hugely important. So that was the first pitfall, which is not writing the user stories well. As I said, it's both the easiest and the hardest to fix. It's the hardest because it takes changes in human behavior. And whenever you get human behavior, it's way easier to pick up a tool and learn a tool than to change the way a team behaves. But the benefits that you get from actually changing the behavior are much more rewarding than switching from Selenium to Playwright to Cypress or whatever. You'll get much more leverage if you change the behaviors than simply by changing a tool. So the next thing is pitfall I find is BDD test scripts, and I alluded to that earlier on. One of the signs that you're not using Cucumber correctly, or if you're doing poor test scripting, is that you'll have flaky tests, you have brittle tests. You can't fit test automation into a sprint. You need to automate stuff that come from the previous sprint. And your tests don't give you any clarity about whether a feature actually works or what a feature does. All of those things are typical signs that you're not using automation in the most effective way possible, because effective automation should give feedback, should give fast feedback, it should give actionable feedback. So if something goes wrong, you should know what goes wrong and why it went wrong and what you need to do to fix it. It also needs to show what you've delivered in business terms, and also needs to be stable. Now, I see there's a question, and above all, it needs to be delivered within the sprint. If you're doing Cucumber afterwards, it's a bit of a waste of time. Very, very little value in writing Cucumber scripts that no one will read. So many people use Cucumber to do test automation to check for bugs in code that's already been implemented. That is a massive waste of time. It's not BDD at all. It's a huge waste of time. If you're going to do exploratory automated tests, let's do it in JUnit or Jasper or whatever your favorite normal testing tool is. Most of the modern testing tools, you can do data-driven tests, you can do very declarative testing, you can do everything you need at that level. You don't need to use Cucumber for that. There's just no point. It just doesn't add any value. So yeah, that was a random question that I just saw pop up. Anyway, so yeah, using Cucumber to automate your test scripts misses both the benefits of Cucumber and of automation and of BDD. I mean, a test script like this is pretty useless in itself. It's a rubbish test script, no matter what language. If it was written in Java or JavaScript or Cypress or whatever, it would still be a rubbish test script. But it's a rubbish, particularly rubbish, it's a doubly rubbish test script if it's written in Cucumber, because it's totally unmaintainable. It doesn't actually describe what business rule verifies. If it breaks, how do you know what went wrong? If it breaks, how do you know, is it the test that's flaky or is it the business rule that's changed? It's just very, very hard to read, also very hard to maintain. So this is the style that I got the guy I was working with, the team I was working with, rewrote a whole lot of scenarios, not quite this bad, but written in this style, and say reduce the code by 80%, reduce the time by 80 to 90%. It makes a massive difference if you ditch these scenarios and write them properly. It just does not serve, they are not fit for purpose. They are basically a massive waste of effort. But they hide a bigger problem. The sort of ones we saw earlier, where we actually get the product owner to approve the requirement so that we know we're actually focusing on the right thing. Requirements that, or scenarios that prove that we are actually doing what the application is supposed to be doing. Means we can actually get more use. Someone was asking about reusable steps. Actually get much more reuse at this, working at this level, much less automation code. I'm working with a very large application with a critical component. We did set up some automation for it, some executable specifications. Spent a week setting up 6 weeks, I think it was, a month, 6 weeks to set it all up. To come up with some executable specifications. We came up with 300 to 500 scenarios, because this is a massive international bank. massive set of requirements. Most of the code was done by that stage. We wrote some code over an ongoing period. I think it's 3 years later. There are, last time I checked, I haven't added any code to it for a long time, but nobody's added any code for several years. But there are something like 12,000 scenarios, and all valid, all business rules, all mission critical scenarios. Is stuff that if it breaks, bad things happen. So the way that is done is that we wrote basically a version of Cucumber, a dialect of Cucumber that expresses the business rules, expresses the business domain very closely. So the business rules can be expressed very clearly in this format, and that makes it very easy to scale. But if you just think in terms of test scripts, that won't work at all. That would just fall over in a heap and crash and burn. I'm seeing the questions come up. I will answer the questions at the end, I think. So yeah, it is key, and that's in this particular example. There is no reason, basically, the team, the product owner or the functional analyst or the actual business people agree on the business rules that need to be changed or updated. They agree on how it's written in this given when then format, because it's standardized now, and then it gets built. So all the automation happens up front. That's what you want to get to. Here's another example. So you can see how sort of crisp and concise this sort of, then we're using a tabular format here, where we can really focus on what matters. We also can get higher coverage because we can do variations without having a huge amount of code. So by and this is not, it's not easy to write good Gherkin. So it's like, it's very easy to write code that's hard to read. It's hard to write code that's easy to read. Gherkin's the same thing. It's easy to write Gherkin that's hard to read or hard to use or poor quality. It's the easier Gherkin is to read and to understand, the more effort or more skill went into actually writing that. And in the Serenity Dojo program that Manoj was referring to earlier, we have live sessions each week, 4 or 5 live sessions a week, and one of those live sessions is always devoted to learning how to write good Gherkin scenarios. It's not something you learn in a half-hour session. That's just something that's an ongoing skill. You get better and better at it as time goes on. But when you can craft that, it does mean that it's sort of kind of like a superpower. It means that you can express the ideas really, really effectively and really crisply, and very much faster than in a traditional approach. So it is really, really powerful. So when we automate test scripts with Cucumber, what typically happens? Well, typically we have a developer who would build something, then a QA will look at the application and come up with maybe a traditional test script, and then afterwards write that given when then format. So this is what's really bad, which doesn't work. Whereas in a BDD approach, it's totally different. We come up, illustrate the rules, illustrate the examples, formulate them into that given when then format, automate them, and then demonstrate them. And somewhere in that circle, you actually do the coding, obviously, but it's a much smoother process. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the key pitfalls, I would say: writing bad stories and writing bad test scripts. So if you can nail those 2 aspects, then you're fairly well placed. But how do you actually get that to work? Well, I find that one of the things I do is I have a program where I take teams in organizations, and I get them up to speed and functional with BDD in 6 weeks. You can't do it in just a short course, but 6 weeks of the light mentoring and whatnot. So we do that with a few coaches, and that works well. But what I find is that when we do that with teams, we need to find internal champions. We need to find people within the teams to champion BDD and want to take it forward and want to learn it so that you can actually grow the BDD practices, just like TDD or software craftsmanship or any good practices. You want people within the organization championing it and trying to get better at it, trying to make sure that people are improving it. Some things that help in that area are having community of practices where you review user stories, where you review acceptance criteria, where you review Cucumber scenarios as a group and try and improve them. But it is important to focus on the quality of the scenarios and the quality of the acceptance criteria and make sure that that stays up to speed. Another thing that's I find helpful is that each team or each project has a BDD dialect. And what I mean by BDD dialect is you come up with a certain number of patterns and ways of expressing requirements that are specific to your domain. And once you find that, you find basically the most efficient way of expressing your ideas for your domain. The Gherkin, the writing of the BDD scenarios becomes a lot smoother, a lot faster. And a side effect of that is that when you find that domain, it makes it much easier to write an automation framework that scales. So this is the problem with writing test scripts in Cucumber. Test scripts don't scale. You need to basically build an automation framework that automates your dialect. That's how you scale it. That's how you can go faster. It takes more effort initially, but it allows you to go much faster afterwards. So that, in a nutshell, is what I mean by the BDD pitfalls. So once again, there is that link. You can go there and get access to another version of this talk with some resources, the slides, and a whole lot of other resources. And now I think we have some time to answer some questions.
Yes, John. We certainly have quite a few questions. Thank you so much. That was quite an insightful session, John. Much needed at this time at a period where people confuse between usage of BDD especially. Well, I have a few questions from myself as well, but I'll give the attendees a chance because there have been some questions coming through all the way through your sessions. The first question from Hitesh is, how can we use BDD in performance testing phase? Is there any advantage of using it for performance testing? Or rather, we could call it as any non-functional requirement-based testing. You could put it in security or accessibility to that as well.
For non-functional requirements, you can use BDD, the discovery process, to actually articulate what you mean by non-functional requirements. And I kind of am of the school that says that there's no such thing as a non-functional requirement. It's got to serve some purpose. If you say the application has to perform fast, what does fast mean? Articulate it. Give me some examples. Is it perceived speed, or is it real speed? Is it the number of transactions in the process, or is it the time the user takes to see a result on the screen? Or is it a concurrent number of users the application needs to support during Christmas shopping periods? Or what do we mean by performance? And articulate those examples. Now, how do you automate them? Totally different question. There are lots of obviously specialized performance tools in that area, but by articulating them and having the conversation and using example mapping works fine for that sort of technique, but coming up with concrete examples and saying, well, you can do it in the given when then format. Just you could say, given the system has 10,000 shoppers, simultaneous shoppers, and they all buy a product, and they should see the shopping cart update within an average of 1 second. You could express things like that, but just the idea of coming up with concrete examples of the non-functional requirements is really important. Or if it's accessibility, you might come up with a concrete example of a user that has a blind user, or someone who's colorblind, or whatever your accessibility issue is. What sort of concrete use cases do you have that you need to deal with? And suddenly that becomes not non-functional, but actually very functional indeed.
Got it. Thanks, Sean. Next question is from an anonymous attendee, but I think you already answered this, but let's touch upon it again, since this is one of the common myths that people think, this is how BD should be implemented. So the question goes like this. Many people use Cucumber to do test automation to check for bugs after the code has already been implemented. Is that BDD? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so like I said, mentioned in the talk, that's absolutely not BDD. That's nothing to do with BDD. That's simply using Cucumber as a bad test scripting tool. So that will cause great pain if you do that. But then again, writing test automation after the fact in that way is relatively not great in any case. So it's not the fault of Cucumber. It's just the fault that that's not a great way of automating.
Absolutely. Next question is from John Beckett. Would you recommend using literal strings or regex for your parameters?
Yeah, I don't use regex very much anymore. I generally use Cucumber 7 Cucumber expressions. They tend to be more powerful and more customizable, but the concept of regex, yes, that's basically a typed regex, where you can define. It's not actually regex, it's much better than regex. So you pass in particular domain objects or domain concepts into your step definitions. But passing variables and making your step definitions configurable, absolutely, yeah. Definitely a very useful thing to do.
Got it. So next question that I had in mind. So John, this is an interesting scenario that I've had, but unfortunately I couldn't continue in the project, so I didn't know how things were handled after I left the project. This was during my consulting time at ThoughtWorks, where the era of event-driven architecture and on the whole microservices thing, right? So people say you don't have to produce a team, and there is a consumer team, they don't have to interact. All you have is a contract, and you look at whatever you have in the contract, and the consumer team can work. So things go like that. So essentially, you mentioned the communication collaboration is very important. So in such cases, given this example that I mentioned, how can someone work past the ambiguities and the questions that might get generated by user stories? Have you come across any situations like that? How do we tackle that?
Well, how do you come up with the contract? You need to have a conversation. So basically, you can use, if you're saying BDD is a shortcut for collaboration, then yeah, use BDD techniques to have the conversation to identify the contract and come up with it. But contract testing is more, contract tests are not meant to be functional, they're protocols. They define the protocol they say that if I send a query with an ID for a customer and the customer doesn't exist, I'll get a 404. If I'm not allowed to access the customer, I'll get some sort of security exception and so forth. And if I get a customer, I'll get these fields. There's a little bit more to understanding the flow of an application than just those sorts of functionalities. And there is a whole lot of business functionality. If I search for a customer, does it do fuzzy searches? Does it is it case sensitive? Does it search related customers? I'm just randomly making up stuff, but that sort of requirement, that's not the contract testing won't touch that. For that sort of requirement, that's where you want to have the conversation and come up with some more business focused scenarios, which may be specific to the microservice. Ideally, they would be specific to the microservice. And then the contract is how do the microservices interact on a technical plane between each other? How do they interact? And again, you have conversations to come up with those contracts.
I get it. Thanks, John. But check up with the team on how they are faring with that, or I might ask them to reach out to you for that. Cool. So next question. I see a couple of questions. I think this is interesting from Swapnil Biswas. He says, we wrote a large number of spec flow based tests. The current test framework has many gaps and many steps can't be reused. What should we do? Is this something we can change from framework to framework, John? How do you see that?
Yeah, framework doesn't. I'm not really sure what you mean by the framework has many gaps and steps can't be used, but I would say there's a red flag when you say you've written some spec flow tests. Same with Cucumber tests or BDD tests. No such thing as a BDD test. There are test scripts written in a scripting language that uses Gherkin that's implemented in the spec flow, but the idea of BDD is that you're writing specifications and you cover requirements. Now, I might be going off topic here, but if you say there are two things here. There's the framework has gaps that implies that your spec flow scenarios are not testing everything, which is normal, because a BDD scenario would not be expected to test everything. You have unit tests and other more comprehensive functional tests to test the finer details. You don't need to test everything with a Gherkin scenario. Steps aren't reusable. That's a design thing. That's how you, like I was saying, when you come up with a domain language specific to your domain, you get much more reuse by design. The reuse just comes naturally. It's not something you try and you don't overthink it. You think in terms of coming up with a dialect, a domain language, and the reuse comes out of that domain. And I'm not sure if I've explained that well, but it's the domain that gives you your reuse, not the fact that you try to make things reusable.
Yeah, I think the last line should be used as a quote, or probably should go in as a tweet thread. Cool. Next question is from Syed. How do we deal with corner scenarios or negative scenarios where we need to cover? Or do we need to have a separate automation suite for this? Or we keep those corner scenarios for exploratory tests during the release?
That's a really good question. And there are different approaches. Now, my general position is that you do not need to, negative scenario, you only need to put negative scenarios or edge cases if the business are interested in them. And the business are interested in negative scenarios. They should be anyway. So there are different counter examples and counterexamples that may appear in the BDD scenarios, but you don't need to put them all in. But you may want to. But if you want to, just because it's convenient, just because you can add, you've got an example table and you can add 5 more examples for counter examples and edge cases, but the business don't care about them, you can just put them in a separate table, or I tend to put them further down the feature file or in a separate feature file just to separate them out a little bit, because they're not really business documentation. They're just in the format because we already have the automation. There's no extra effort to do the edge cases. If it's a lot of extra effort to do the edge cases, my preference is to do them at a lower level, or do them using a tool that's easier to refactor and easier to work with. So there's no obligation to do everything as a BDD scenario.
Got it. I'm afraid we have already right on time. But thank you so much, John, for being with us on the first ever edition of Voices of Community. As I said earlier, it is very special for us. It's the beginning of a new a series that we're gonna do for all the coming months, having one thought leader per month and so on. And I think what more we could ask for, having a better session about BDD pitfalls and how to avoid them. I mean, you can look at the comments coming from the Zoom chat. I think that gives us attendee testimony on how people enjoy the session. And I hope you enjoyed as well, John.
It was a lot of fun. I mean, I enjoyed it. It was great.
Thank you so much, John. And thanks everyone for joining for different parts of the world. It's wonderful to see people joining in from different parts of the world. And stay tuned for the next edition of Voices of Community. Until then, take care. Bye from Manoj, John, and LambdaTest.
Thank you. Bye-bye.